Ghost leader, we're surrounded. What's your call? The voice crackled through the old recording, thin and distorted, but unmistakably steady beneath the static, a calm that didn't belong in a situation like that, the kind of calm that made men stop talking and start listening, and for a brief second, the room fell into a silence that felt heavier than the equipment lining the walls, heavier than the rifles resting against reinforced steel racks, heavier than the weight of expectation pressing down on every operator inside that Delta briefing room. Then the audio cut out with a sharp click, replaced by the low hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet shuffle of boots on polished concrete, and just like that, the moment was gone, dismissed as nothing more than an old archived transmission pulled for training, another ghost story buried in classified logs. Staff Sergeant Ryan Keller leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw tight with impatience as he glanced at the digital clock glowing on the far wall. The mission brief was already running late, and the last thing he needed was another distraction, especially not from someone who clearly didn't belong there. The door at the rear of the room opened without ceremony, no knock, no announcement, just a quiet shift in air pressure as a man stepped inside, and for a moment, no one reacted, because no one expected anything worth reacting to. He didn't look like he belonged in a Tier 1 operations room. Not with that worn field jacket that had seen too many seasons, not with the faint dust on his boots like he'd walked farther than most men in the room had ever been asked to go, not with the absence of rank, patches, or any visible sign of authority. He just stood there, still, as if the noise of the room passed through him without consequence, his eyes moving once across the layout of screens, maps, and operators, not searching, not impressed, just measuring. Keller noticed him last, his gaze drifting over with the kind of casual dismissal reserved for maintenance staff or misplaced civilians, and his expression hardened almost immediately, irritation sharpening his tone before he even spoke. "You're in the wrong room," he said flatly, not loud, but loud enough, the kind of statement that didn't invite correction, only compliance. A few of the operators exchanged quick glances, subtle smirks forming, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, because this was their world, controlled, precise, exclusive, and anyone who didn't fit the pattern was a problem to be removed. The man didn't respond, not right away, his posture unchanged, hands relaxed at his sides, as if the words hadn't quite reached him yet, or perhaps as if they didn't carry enough weight to matter. Keller exhaled slowly through his nose, pushing himself up from his chair, boots echoing once against the floor as he stepped forward, closing the distance with a confidence built from years of being right, years of being the one people listened to. "This is a restricted briefing," he added, sharper now. "So unless you've got a clearance badge you forgot to show, you need to turn around and walk out that door." Still nothing, not a protest, not an apology, not even a flicker of embarrassment, just that same steady gaze, drifting past Keller for half a second toward the mission map projected across the wall, a glance so brief it would have been easy to miss, except for the way it lingered just a fraction longer on one specific point, like a man noticing a detail no one else had seen. Specialist Noah Brooks, seated near the edge of the table, caught that glance, and something about it didn't sit right, not the movement itself, but the absence of uncertainty behind it, because everyone else in that room had been arguing over that exact section of terrain for the past 20 minutes, and none of them had looked that certain. Keller followed the man's line of sight, then scoffed quietly, shaking his head as if he'd just confirmed what he already believed, that this was nothing more than an interruption, a mistake that needed correcting. "Hey," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping just enough to carry an edge, "I'm talking to you." And this time, the man's eye shifted back to him, calm, clear, and completely unbothered. The kind of look that didn't challenge authority, but didn't recognize it either, and for the first time since he walked in, the room felt just a little smaller, like something unseen had entered with him and quietly taken its place among them. The air in the room shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call it out, but just enough for the operators closest to the center table to pause mid-motion, fingers hovering over tablets, eyes flicking briefly between Keller and the man who still had not moved an inch. The overhead lights cast a pale, even glow across the concrete walls, reflecting off polished rifle cases and the matte surfaces of mission screens, everything in its place, everything controlled, except for this one variable that did not respond the way it should. Keller stepped closer, close enough now to make the distance personal, the kind of proximity meant to assert control without raising his voice, his boots stopping just short of the man's worn ones, the contrast between them almost deliberate, new versus old, issued versus carried, authority versus something that did not need to prove itself. "You deaf, sir?" Keller asked, the words landing with a trace of sarcasm, just enough for the others to hear the tone beneath it, and a few quiet chuckles followed, low and brief, the kind of background noise that reinforced the hierarchy in the room. The man's gaze held steady, not locked onto Keller, but not avoiding him either, a neutral ground that somehow felt more unsettling than direct defiance, and for a second longer than expected, he said nothing, as if he were letting the moment settle into place. Before deciding whether it deserved a response, then, slowly, he shifted his attention back toward the mission board, a large digital projection stretching nearly 10 feet across the wall, layered with terrain data, satellite overlays, and route markers, the kind of display that took weeks of preparation and hours of argument to finalize. Brooks followed that movement again, his brow tightening just slightly, because the man was not scanning the board like someone trying to understand it, he was looking at it like someone who already did. Hey, Keller snapped, turning halfway to glance back at the others as if inviting them to witness the exchange. We are in the middle of something here, his voice carrying more now, not loud, but sharpened, precise, the tone of someone who expected immediate compliance. One of the operators at the far end leaned back in his chair, arms folding, watching with open curiosity now, while another muttered under his breath about security being asleep at the door. But no one intervened, because this was Keller's room in this moment, and everyone knew it. The man finally spoke. His voice low, even, carrying just enough weight to cut through the layered hum of electronics without forcing it. Your southern approach is exposed, he said, not as a suggestion, not as a guess, but as a simple observation, delivered without emphasis, as if it were already understood. The room did not react immediately, the words hanging there for a fraction longer than expected, not because they were loud, but because they did not fit. And Keller's expression shifted, irritation tightening into something closer to disbelief as he turned fully back toward the board, eyes narrowing slightly as if confirming what he already knew. We have eyes on every angle of that route, Keller replied quickly, dismissively, tapping a point on the screen with the back of his knuckle. Drones, thermal, full coverage, he added, his tone carrying the confidence of systems that had never failed him before. The man did not argue, did not elaborate. He simply tilted his head a fraction, the smallest acknowledgement of what had just been said, before his gaze returned to that same point on the map, the one Brooks had noticed earlier, and for the first time, Brooks felt a quiet unease settle in his chest, not fear, not even doubt, but the uncomfortable sense that something important had just been said too simply, like a detail overlooked because it did not come wrapped in the language they were used to trusting. Keller exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if brushing the moment aside. Already done with it, already moving on. All right, that is enough, he said, stepping back just slightly and gesturing toward the door with a firm motion. You need to leave, now. And the room seemed to lean with that command, waiting for it to be followed, because in this place, it always was. But the man did not move, not yet, and the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was beginning to take shape, something heavier, something that did not belong to Keller anymore. The silence held just long enough to become uncomfortable, not the kind that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that forms when something does not behave the way it is supposed to, when a command is given and the world does not immediately comply. Keller's hand remained extended toward the door for a second longer before it slowly dropped back to his side, his jaw tightening as he recalibrated, because this was no longer about removing a distraction. This was about control, and control, in a room like this, was not optional. You are done here, he said again, slower this time, each word spaced deliberately, as if clarity alone would resolve the situation. But the man did not shift, did not even glance toward the exit, his attention still resting on the mission board with that same quiet focus, as though the conversation behind him had already past its point of relevance. A faint sound broke from the far end of the table, the soft tap of a pen against a tablet, and Brooks leaned forward slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing at the map as he followed the line the man had pointed out earlier, tracing the southern approach with a more critical eye now, not because he doubted their data, but because something about the way it had been dismissed felt incomplete. We have satellite coverage every 30 seconds, one of the operators muttered, almost defensively, pulling up a secondary feed on his screen, the blue glow reflecting across his face as lines of data scrolled into view. Nothing moves through there without being flagged, he added, more to the room than to the man, reinforcing the system, reinforcing the certainty they all relied on. The man's voice came again, just as even as before, not raised, not insistent. 30 seconds is a long time if you know where not to be, he said, and the words did not challenge the system, they simply existed alongside it, quiet, unforced, and that was what made them harder to ignore. Keller let out a short breath through his nose, something between a scoff and a restrained laugh, shaking his head as he turned halfway toward the others. This is exactly why we do not let random civilians wander into operational briefings, he said, gesturing loosely with one hand, but there was a slight edge now, a tightening beneath the surface that had not been there before, because the room was not responding the way it usually did, the quick agreement, the automatic alignment behind his authority. It was slower now, more fragmented. Brooks shifted in his seat, fingers hovering over the map interface as he zoomed in on the terrain, increasing the resolution, layering elevation data over the route, and there it was, subtle, almost insignificant, a shallow depression running parallel to the southern edge, just enough to break line of sight at certain angles, just enough to disappear for a window that matched exactly what had been said. He did not speak immediately, his throat tightening slightly as he processed it, because acknowledging it out loud would mean validating the man who had pointed it out. And that meant stepping outside the expected flow of the room. Keller noticed the movement, his eyes snapping toward Brooks with a quick, assessing look. "What?" he asked, not aggressively, but sharply enough to demand an answer, and Brooks hesitated for half a second before responding. "There is a dip in the terrain," he said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "It is narrow, but it could create a blind spot depending on the angle," and the room shifted again, quieter now, more focused, as a few heads turned back toward the board, re-evaluating what they thought they already understood. Keller stared at the map for a beat, then another, his expression tightening as he recalculated, not because he could not see it, but because he had not seen it first, and that mattered more than it should have. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his gaze moved back to the man, who had not changed his posture, had not claimed the moment, had not even acknowledged the correction. He simply stood there, as if none of this was new to him, as if this was how things had always worked. The room was no longer dismissing him, not entirely, but it had not accepted him either. It was caught in between, and in that space, something unfamiliar began to take shape, not authority, not yet, but the quiet suggestion of it, and for the first time since he walked in, Keller did not immediately speak, and that silence said more than any command he had given so far. The room did not return to its previous rhythm, not fully, because once something unseen is revealed, even in the smallest detail, it changes the way everything else is perceived, and now every operator in that space was looking at the board a little longer than before, double-checking lines they had already trusted, running quiet recalculations in their heads without saying it out loud. Keller straightened slightly, drawing in a slow breath as if resetting the balance, his posture firm, shoulders squared, the image of control carefully reassembled, but there was a fraction of hesitation now, a thin crack in the certainty that had filled his voice earlier, and he masked it the only way he knew how, by shifting the focus away from the man and back onto procedure. "Adjust the drone sweep interval," he said, his tone clipped and efficient, eyes still on the map. "Tighten it to 15 seconds over that sector." And immediately, fingers moved across screens, commands entered, confirmations echoed back in short, precise responses, the system correcting itself, adapting, proving that it could respond, that it was still in control. The man did not react to the adjustment, did not nod, did not acknowledge it. He simply watched, his gaze steady, as if observing something familiar play out exactly as expected. Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling under his breath, his attention no longer split between the board and the man but moving between them with equal weight now, because the gap between those 2 points had narrowed in a way he could not ignore. "It would not matter," the man said quietly, his voice cutting through the renewed activity with the same calm precision, and this time, more heads turned, not all at once, but enough to shift the center of attention again. Keller's jaw tightened as he looked over, the patience in his expression thinning. "And why is that?" he asked, the question controlled, but edged, inviting an answer. While already preparing to reject it, the man's eyes moved across the map once more, tracing the terrain with that same quiet familiarity. "Because they would not move during your sweep," he said, "they would move before it, then wait," and he paused for just a fraction, not for effect, but as if allowing the logic to settle on its own. "You are watching movement, not absence," he added, and the words landed differently this time, not as a contradiction, but as a shift in perspective, subtle but difficult to dismiss once heard. One of the operators frowned at his screen, adjusting filters, toggling layers, searching not for what was there, but for what was not, and the room grew quieter again, not from tension, but from focus, the kind that comes when something begins to make sense in a way that challenges the original assumption. Keller remained still, For a moment, eyes fixed on the board, processing, recalibrating, the gears turning behind a composed exterior, and then he shook his head once, short and controlled, as if rejecting the implication before it could take root. "We do not base operations on guesswork," he said firmly, turning slightly toward the man. "We base them on verified data," and there it was again, the line drawn, the boundary reasserted. But this time it sounded less like a rule and more like a defense. The man met his gaze, not confrontational, not dismissive, just steady. "Data tells you what has happened," he said, his voice even. "Experience tells you what will," and the room did not move after that, not immediately, because there was nothing in the tone that invited argument, nothing in the posture that demanded belief, just a statement placed carefully into the space between them, and for the first time since the exchange began, no one laughed, no one muttered, no one filled the silence, because something about the way it was said made it difficult to treat as anything less than real. The words did not echo, they settled, like dust in still air, quiet but impossible to ignore once noticed, and for a moment, no one moved, not because they agreed, but because they could not immediately dismiss what had just been placed in front of them. Keller's eyes held on the man a second longer than before, searching for something that would reduce him back to what he had been when he first walked in, an outsider, a mistake. But that image was no longer clean, it had been disrupted, and that disruption was starting to spread through the room in ways Keller did not like. He shifted his weight slightly, turning back toward the table as if reclaiming the center of gravity. "We adjust for patterns," he said, his voice measured, controlled, each word placed with intent. "We do not assume them," and a few of the operators nodded almost automatically, not because they had evaluated the statement, but because it aligned with the system they trusted. The man did not counter immediately. He simply watched the board again, his eyes moving slowly across the terrain, following lines that were not marked, reading something beneath the layers of data, and Brooks noticed it again, that same absence of hesitation, the same quiet certainty that did not rely on confirmation. Brooks leaned forward, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, his attention narrowing as he replayed the last few minutes in his mind, the dip in the terrain, the timing of the drone sweep, the idea of movement hidden not by speed but by stillness, and something in that sequence began to connect in a way that made the room feel different, less controlled, more open. "If they move before the sweep," Brooks said slowly, almost to himself but loud enough to be heard, "and hold position inside that depression, they would disappear from both angles." And now the room reacted, not loudly, but collectively, a subtle shift as multiple operators adjusted their screens, layering new variables, testing the scenario against their models. Keller glanced at Brooks, then back at the board, his expression tightening again, but this time it was not just resistance, it was calculation, because the idea was no longer isolated, it had been picked up, examined. And now it was beginning to show shape. "Run it," Keller said after a brief pause, his tone sharp, decisive, reclaiming authority through action, and immediately, one of the operators initiated a simulation, the system processing terrain data, timing intervals, and line-of-sight variables with quiet efficiency. The room watched in near silence as the projected path updated, markers shifting, visibility windows recalculated. And there it was, subtle but undeniable, a gap, not large, not obvious, but present, a moment where presence could become absence if timed correctly. No one spoke right away, because the system had just confirmed what had been said without data, and that was not something they were used to. Keller exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the screen, and for a fraction of a second, something unguarded passed across his face, not doubt, but recognition, the kind that comes when reality does not match expectation. He turned back toward the man, slower this time, his posture still firm, but no longer dismissive. "You are saying they would stage there," he said, not asking, not quite, but seeking confirmation in a way that had not been there before. The man's response was simple, almost quiet enough to miss if the room had not been so still. "I am saying that is where I would," and the distinction hung in the air, precise, deliberate, not a theory, not a prediction, but a reflection of experience, and for the first time, the room was no longer deciding whether to listen, it was beginning to understand that it already was. The distinction did not fade after it was spoken, it settled deeper, threading itself into the way every man in that room now looked at the board, because it was no longer just a theoretical gap in coverage, it was a position chosen by someone who understood exactly how the system thought, and how to move inside it without ever appearing on it. Keller held his gaze on the man for a moment longer, measuring him again. But this time the measurement had changed, it was no longer about where he did Not belong, it was about where he might have been before. You would, Keller repeated quietly, not mocking, not dismissive, just confirming the words as if testing their weight, and then he turned back to the board, his voice sharper now, directed at the team. Shift the approach, he said, offset the southern route by 50 yards east, tighten the angle, and rerun the entry window, and the room moved instantly, commands executed, data recalculated, the system adapting again, but this time it was not leading, it was following. Brooks watched the adjustment unfold, his attention flicking once more to the man, who had not moved from his position near the door, still outside the circle of operators, still without rank, without identification, and yet the entire room was now reorganizing itself around something he had said in less than a dozen words. The simulation updated, the new path projected across the screen, and the blind spot narrowed, not eliminated, but reduced, its timing disrupted, its advantage weakened, and a quiet exhale moved through the room, subtle, collective, the kind that comes when a problem shifts from unknown to manageable, that closes it, one of the operators said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, and Keller gave a short nod, his posture settling, control reasserted, but not in the same way as before. It was no longer absolute, it had been adjusted, refined. The man's voice came again, just as calm, just as steady. No, he said. And the single word cut through the room with more force than anything he had said so far, not loud, not aggressive, but final, and the room stilled again. Every movement pausing just enough to acknowledge it. Keller's head turned slowly, his expression tightening, not with irritation this time, but with something closer to challenge. No, he repeated, the word deliberate, inviting explanation while already preparing to counter it. The man's eyes returned to the board, tracing the updated route, and then slightly beyond it, as if following a line no one else had drawn. You move to where they expect you to move, he said, his voice even. Because you saw what they wanted you to see, and the implication settled immediately, heavier than before, because it did not just question the adjustment, it questioned the assumption behind it. Brooks felt it first, that shift, that quiet realization that the problem was no longer just about terrain or timing, it was about intent, about perspective, and he leaned forward again, his fingers hovering over the controls, not acting yet, just waiting, listening. Keller held his ground, his jaw set, but his eyes flicked once more to the map, and this time he did not dismiss the idea outright, because the pattern was no longer clean, it had layers now, and each layer made the previous certainty less stable. Then where? Keller asked, the question coming before he could stop it, not commanded, not asserted, but asked, and the room felt that difference immediately, the shift from control to inquiry, small, but undeniable. The man did not answer right away, he simply stepped forward for the first time since entering the room, closing a few feet of distance with quiet, unhurried steps, his boots making almost no sound against the floor, and when he reached the edge of the table, he did not take a marker, did not touch the screen, he only looked, his gaze steady, as if confirming something only he could see, and then, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he said, "You are still looking at the map," and paused just long enough for the words to settle. "They are looking at you," and the room did not move after that, because for the first time, the problem was no longer on the screen, it was in the space between them. The words lingered longer than anything else that had been said in that room, not because they were louder, but because they shifted the direction of thought entirely, and for a moment. Every operator stood still inside that realization, not looking at the screen, not looking at each other, but feeling the weight of being seen instead of seeing. Keller's posture remained firm, but something behind his eyes changed, a subtle recalibration as he processed the implication, because this was no longer about adjusting routes or tightening coverage, this was about being anticipated, about being read before the first step was even taken. "Explain that," Keller said, his voice controlled, but quieter now, not demanding, not dismissing, simply asking in a way that had not existed earlier, and the room felt it, that shift, small but unmistakable. The man did not rush his answer, he never had, his gaze moving slowly across the board as if aligning what he saw with something older, something not stored in any system. "You built your plan around what you can detect," he said evenly, "so they built theirs around what you cannot," and again, the words did not push, they settled, fitting into the space that had already been opened. Brooks felt a tightening in his chest, not fear, not uncertainty, but recognition, the kind that comes when a pattern begins to reveal itself from the outside in, and he leaned forward again, fingers resting lightly against the console, his eyes scanning not the markers on the map, but the empty spaces between them. one of the operators adjusted his headset slightly, glancing toward Keller as if waiting for direction, but Keller did not immediately respond, his attention fixed on the board, tracing lines that no longer felt stable. "If they are watching us," Brooks said carefully, his voice measured, "then every adjustment we make becomes part of their model," and the room absorbed that, the idea unfolding in real time, because it meant that every correction, every improvement, every attempt to close a gap might be feeding something unseen. Keller exhaled slowly, his hand resting against the edge of the table, fingers tapping once, a small, controlled motion that betrayed the calculation happening beneath the surface. "Then we stop adjusting," he said after a moment, the statement firm, reclaiming ground. "We hold the original plan," and a few heads nodded again, the logic clean, simple, decisive. The man's gaze shifted to him, steady, unchanged. "That is still a reaction," he said, and the words landed heavier than before, because they did not contradict the plan, they reframed it entirely. The room went quiet again, not tense, not chaotic, but focused in a way it had not been at the start, because now every option carried weight, every decision felt visible beyond the walls of the room. Keller straightened slightly, his expression tightening, not in frustration, but in concentration, and for the first time, he did not immediately respond. He allowed the silence to hold, to stretch, to settle into something usable. Brooks glanced at the man again, studying him more closely now, not just his words, but the way he stood, the way he spoke, the absence of urgency, the absence of doubt, and something in the back of his mind stirred, not a memory, not yet, but a familiarity he could not place. The man's eyes moved once more across the room, not scanning, not assessing, just observing, and then he said quietly, "You are thinking like operators," and paused just long enough for the statement to register. "They are thinking like survivors," and the difference between those two ideas settled into the room like a shift in gravity, subtle, but impossible to ignore. No one spoke immediately after that, because there was nothing quick to say, nothing that could dismiss it cleanly, and for the first time since the briefing began, the room was no longer operating on certainty, it was operating on awareness, and in that space, the man who had walked in unrecognized was no longer outside the system, he was quietly rewriting how it was being seen. The room did not return to movement after that. It stayed suspended in that narrow space between understanding and acceptance, where every man present knew something had shifted but no one had yet decided what to do with it, and in that silence, the hum of the overhead light seemed louder, sharper, like the environment itself was waiting for direction. Keller stood still at the head of the table, his hand resting flat against the surface now. No longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience. Just grounded, his eyes fixed on the board but not seeing it the same way, because the lines and markers that once felt precise now felt incomplete, like a language missing half its meaning. Brooks felt it more clearly than the others, that quiet pressure building in the room, not from urgency, but from recognition, and his mind began to connect fragments he had not consciously linked before. The voice from the recording at the start of the briefing, the calm inside it, the same absence of hesitation, the same way the words had not asked for permission to be believed. He glanced toward the man again, studying him more closely now, not just his presence, but the stillness of it, the way he stood without needing space, without needing acknowledgement, and something clicked, faint at first, like a memory surfacing from deeper than thought. "That recording," Brooks said slowly, his voice careful, almost cautious, "the one from the archive," and the room shifted slightly as attention moved toward him, Keller's gaze following, sharp again, focused. "What about it?" Keller asked, and Brooks hesitated for just a fraction before continuing. The voice, it sounded like this, and he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to, because the implication settled on its own. Keller's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, his eyes narrowing as he looked back at the man, not dismissing now, not evaluating as an outsider, but searching for alignment, for confirmation of something he had not considered before. "That recording is classified," Keller said, his tone measured, controlled, but there was a question beneath it now, an opening he had not allowed earlier, and for the first time since the man entered the room, Keller did not speak from authority, he spoke from uncertainty. The man did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward Brooks, then back to the board, as if the question itself was not the point, as if the answer had already been given in pieces and simply needed to be recognized. The door behind them opened with a quiet mechanical click, and the sound cut through the room with more weight than it should have, because no one had been expecting it, not in this moment, not in this silence, and every head turned almost instinctively. Colonel James Whittaker stepped inside without announcement, his presence immediate, not because of volume, but because of the way the room responded to him, operators straightening subtly, posture adjusting, attention locking in without being told. His eyes moved quickly across the room, taking in the scene in a single sweep, the paused screens, the still operators, the man standing near the table, and something in his expression shifted the moment his gaze landed there. He stopped, not abruptly, but completely, as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist for a second, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was absolute. Keller turned toward him, ready to speak, to explain, to regain control of the situation, but the words did not come, because Whitaker's posture had already changed, his shoulders straightening, his stance tightening, not into command, but into recognition. The colonel took one step forward, then another, his eyes fixed on the man, and when he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried through the room with a clarity that left no space for interpretation. "Sir," he said, and the word alone shifted everything, not because of rank, but because of the respect inside it, and then, with a slight nod that felt heavier than any order he could have given, he added, "Ghost leader," and the room did not react, it froze, completely, because in that moment, every unanswered question aligned at once. And the man who had walked in unrecognized was no longer undefined, he was known. No one moved after the word was spoken, not because they were unsure of what it meant, but because they understood it too clearly, and in that understanding, everything that had happened in the room rearranged itself in an instant, every glance, every dismissal, every quiet correction now carrying a weight that had not been there before. Keller felt it first, not as a thought, but as a shift in posture, his shoulders tightening, his stance adjusting without conscious command, the reflex of recognition overriding everything that had come before, and for a fraction of a second, he stood completely still, his earlier confidence dissolving into something more grounded, more precise. Brooks lowered his gaze slightly, not out of submission, but out of realization, replaying every word the man had spoken, hearing them now with clarity that had not been available before, and the connection locked into place, the voice from the recording, the calm, the certainty. It had not just sounded familiar, it had been the same. Around the room, operators who had been leaning, shifting, speaking moments ago now stood or sat in complete stillness, their focus no longer on the board, no longer on the data, but on the man who had never asked for their attention and had never needed it. Colonel Whitaker remained where he stood, his posture firm, his expression composed, but the respect in his presence was unmistakable, not exaggerated, not performative, just absolute, the kind that did not need explanation. The man acknowledged it with the smallest movement, a slight nod, nothing more, no words, no correction, just recognition returned in the same quiet language it had been given. Keller took a step back, not retreating, but resetting, creating space where there had been none, his voice absent now, because there was nothing he could say that would not sound unnecessary, and for the first time since the briefing began, he did not try to fill the silence. The screens continued to glow against the walls, data still moving, simulation still running, but none of it held the same gravity, because the center of the room had shifted completely, from systems to experience, from prediction to understanding. Brooks straightened slightly in his chair, his attention returning to the board, but not in the same way as before. Now he looked at it through a different lens, not asking what the system could confirm, but what it might be missing. And the difference was immediate, subtle adjustments forming in his mind before they ever touched the screen. The man turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room one last time, not assessing, not instructing, just observing, as if confirming that what needed to be understood had already been placed where it belonged. And then he stepped back, the same quiet movement with which he had entered, no announcement, no expectation, just a presence that did not linger. No one stopped him, no one spoke, because there was nothing to add, nothing to question. The lesson had already settled into the room in a way that did not require reinforcement. Keller watched him go, his expression steady, but changed, the sharp edges of earlier authority replaced with something more measured, more aware, and when the door closed behind the man with a soft mechanical click, the sound marked not an ending, but a shift. The room remained silent for a moment longer, and then, slowly, almost instinctively, the operators turned back to the board, not to resume where they had left off, but to begin again, this time seeing more than what was displayed, and in that quiet reset, without orders, without acknowledgement, every man in that room adjusted, not just the plan, but the way they thought about it, because some lessons did not arrive as instructions, they arrived as presence, and once seen, they could not be unseen.